I'm Ralph Preston. William Lowe and I are back for yet another roadmap. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the questions that you should be asking your physical therapists. Actually, this discussion will be bigger than that because it's really a relationship that you have with your physical therapist. So we'll get into that relationship a little bit. And William, you usually start us off, and I know you have some thoughts on the relationship that you have and should have with your physical therapist. So why don't you get us going like you usually do?
Yeah, sure thing. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about the question that you should ask your therapist because I think in recovery after stroke and in my own experience as a stroke survivor and also helping my own personal clients and the stroke survivors that I help in their own recovery, what I often find in the is is the common theme is that generally speaking, the quality of your recovery is dictated by, I guess, your relationship with your therapist, and I guess your relationship with yourself. And what I mean by when I say that is that recovery after stroke isn't so much about the therapist guiding you in your journey, but it's also about yourself. And what I mean by that is that it's about how open you are to obviously change and how open you are to trying new exercises to actually see recovery happen or actually try things to actually try to notice the subtle changes that would come with trying new exercises and exposing your brain to exercises which would facilitate recovery. And also, I guess, how open you are and willing you are to collaborate with someone else, someone else such as a therapist to actually move the needle forward in your recovery after stroke. So with that being said, I think that for every stroke survivor, one of the key things to know is that when you're starting out this journey, and this will apply to the stroke survivors who are watching this who are in the early stages of their recovery. One of the key things to really take to heart is that the the quality of your recovery is going to be dictated by your relationship with your supporting healthcare team or your supporting therapist, and how you're going to leverage the these therapists to help you in your recovery. And what this means is obviously going into your sessions because you only have a limited amount through insurance and asking the right questions so that you have, I guess, the clarity on knowing how to help yourself when you run out of insurance so that you can help yourself in your own recovery and know what works and what doesn't so that you can avoid making mistakes in your recovery. So one of the most important questions I think you should ask as a stroke survivor in the early stages of your recovery when you're seeing your therapist, and especially when you get to the rehab stage, is is really making a effort to steer therapy sessions in the direction that you want them to go. So speaking from my own experience and from what I've been told by other stroke survivors is sometimes in therapy sessions, the exercises which are given to stroke survivors to help them recover, sorry. Some of these actually the majority of these might be focused towards a compensation approach in recovery after stroke. In other words, what this means is teaching the stroke survivor how to do things without actually having to actually recover or learn the movements required on their affected side to actually perform things or do things they used to do before their stroke. So, for example, this might mean using aids, using using particular aids in their recovery to help them do things like pulling up their socks, or or maybe using one-handed techniques to get away with doing a two-handed task, which would require two hands to do. So because a lot of the therapy approaches out there, a a majority of them focus on a compensation approach, it can be really hard to actually see some substantial recovery and see some actual results when you get your sessions through insurance. And because you only get a limited amount, and I believe it's 24 a year when you were telling me this, Ralph, earlier, it can be really easy. It can be really easy to use up all of your insurance and come away with no results or no changes in your recovery after stroke. And obviously, this can be really disheartening for the stroke survivor because it's going to be really easy to lose faith in your recovery and just accept 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 that this is as good as it's going to get, or as many other stroke survivors have told me when their therapists have told them that this is the most that they can do for them and that their recovery isn't going to get better. And quite often this happens because I believe that a lot of the recovery approaches in insurance do not focus more so on recovery, but rather on doing things to actually compensate or get around not using the affected side to actually do things before you had your stroke. So having said that, I think that it's really important for stroke survivors to yes, steer their sessions the way in the direction that they want it to go. So asking the therapist to focus more so on recovery focused exercises with the goal of actually getting back movements and really setting that expectation for recovery rather than compensating by not using the affected side, so that you can get away with using what you do have after your stroke to do the things that you used to do before your stroke. And I think the way to do this is actually by setting accountability between yourself as a stroke survivor and also the therapist. So, for example, if you're getting therapy through insurance as a stroke survivor, and you notice that for the last 6 weeks or for the last 12 weeks, your therapist has been asking you to do the exact same exercise, promising you that you might get a result after a couple of weeks, and you've noticed that there's been no substantial change, then obviously something needs to change. And in this case, as a stroke survivor, it's really up to yourself to really probe the therapist on additional exercises which might actually create a response in your brain to recover, sorry, rather than the one that they've been suggesting for the last 6 or 7 weeks. Because in my experience, the typical exercise, it takes about 2 or 3 weeks to actually reach a plateau, which is basically where your brain goes on autopilot and it doesn't feel the need to actually work a lot harder to get more recovery back. So if you're doing the exact same thing over and over again, it almost becomes like a broken record to your brain, and something definitely needs to change in order to reach your best possible recovery after your stroke. So I think accountability goes hand in hand with setting expectations for what you would expect in a therapy session with the therapist. I think as a stroke survivor, if you go into a therapy session without any expectations, then it can be very easy to obviously get into that situation where you're doing the exact same thing over and over again, and you're not seeing any substantial changes at all, and you reach the end of your insurance for the year, and you walk away with no changes in your recovery, and just a lot of waste of time. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that I really think that as a stroke survivor in your recovery journey, it's really important to ask questions and really keep your therapist accountable, because especially in the early stages of your recovery after stroke, your occupational therapist or your physical therapist, they're going to be the ones who are going to be able to most support you in your journey. And if you can leverage them to actually give you some information on how to recover, then you can walk away after each therapy session knowing why you need to do things and what you need to do when you're on your own to actually get recovery going. Because at the end of the day, most of the recovery after stroke happens outside of therapy sessions. It doesn't happen in therapy sessions. And because this is a lifelong journey, I think it's important to develop a really important mindset when it comes to recovery after stroke. And this comes from making sure that you're really using the most of the resources that you have at hand in order to actually help you reach your best recovery possible. And this really comes down to the two things which I mentioned, which is keeping a focus on recovery and not compensation, and also keeping yourself accountable and also keeping your therapist accountable and setting the expectations for what you want out of therapy, and also asking your therapist why they're suggesting certain exercises in the exercise program that they're providing you and how these are related to or relevant to the goals which you have in your recovery after stroke. Because if the exercises that they're giving you aren't related to your goals, or they're not relevant at all to your goals of recovery, and they're focused more on compensation, it's likely that you're going to get the shorter end of the stick, and it's going to be very hard to actually see some changes. So that was a really long roundabout way of what I think about asking questions from your therapist. And I think I've talked enough for now. And I just want to toss it back to you, Ralph. Just hearing all of that, and I know you and I, we've had similar experiences in our recovery journey. Do you have any thoughts, or do you have anything else to add on what you think you should ask your therapist about?
Well, first I was just going to react to what you said. Yeah, I wrote down a few things to talk about. I think the first point that I heard you making was that it's your responsibility basically to get better. The therapist can help you. The therapist cannot make you better. You have to make yourself better. You have to take responsibility for your recovery, which includes how you interact with your physical therapist. And I've got some more thoughts on that, but I'll go through the other things that you said. I don't know, different insurance companies have different metrics for how many, well, let's put it this way, they have different guidelines for how many visits they intend to pay for. They also have different metrics, like if you fail to improve, they'll say you plateaued and they can end you early. If you're doing pretty well and keep making your goals, they can extend you a little bit. But I think, and this is an opinion, I think that some of this compensatory approach comes from the fact that over the last 10 years, the number of insurance visits has diminished. Whether it's 30, 24, 20, 16, regardless of the insurance company or whatever, the total number that survivors are getting is less than it was 10 years ago. And I think that kind of forces the therapist to try and do what they can with you in the time that they have you. And a lot of them will see that as teaching you to compensate as opposed to get better. Since you don't get better at physical therapy, one or two times a week. It's really more like a piano teacher and student relationship. The way you should look at it, like you touched on this, is that you should be learning about the things that work for you, picking their brains, asking for homework, a number of things, so that you can continue when you no longer can see them. Let's see, what else? You talked a little bit about changing things up, giving them the same exercise for a number of weeks. One of my questions, and I'll jump back to the beginning after this, Well, one of my questions was, you know, how are you going to keep me from plateauing? That's kind of dicey. How do you deal with a plateau? This should be something that you should discuss with them on some level. Because if you sit back, well, therapists can plateau you, or you can have your own plateau by not changing up the exercises. So if your therapist isn't changing up your exercises, if you're not like, if they're not saying, okay, you got that down, now try this, if you're not moving on, then maybe you should have a little discussion about that. So now I'm going to jump back to the beginning because one of the last things you mentioned was goals. So I think that, before you go to physical therapy, you should set some goals like, I want to walk. I want to play golf again. I want to, whatever your goals are. I want to get this hand to work so I can cook again. I want to be able to pick up my baby or whatever. Different people have different goals. If you come in to the initial sessions with goals, then you can discuss them and you can form a plan. That would be something to discuss. A lot of these, like I said in the intro, are going to be like not exactly questions, but about the relationship. I'm a big believer in doing homework. Just like if you showed up at your piano lesson once a week, you wouldn't get it and not practice during the week, your piano teacher would pretty soon figure out you weren't doing anything at home. Therapists like to help people, so they like to help the people that they see. I believe they'll help you more if you're doing homework and demonstrating that you're serious about your recovery. They're certainly going to take the rest of your interaction, like talking about goals and plateauing. The more you know, and the more you show them that and the more you show them that you're willing to do the work, the better relationship you're going to have. One of the questions I wrote down was, what do you expect from me? Is something reasonable to ask a physical therapist. Let's see, what else did I write down? Oh, every week they should give you feedback. So if they're not, you should be asking for feedback. That's a part of the whole homework. Feedback is kind of a loop, and you should be involved in things like, okay, they say you're doing well with that, ask them, okay, what's next? What can I be doing next? If you take that kind of initiative, they will they notice that kind of thing. They know when the people come in, they know the difference between somebody who's doing their work at home and somebody who comes in and acts like the therapist can make them better. So those are some thoughts on it. Let's see. One of the questions I saw online was, how do I stay motivated? But that's really not so much an issue for your physical therapist. Yeah, if you're having trouble being motivated, you might discuss it with them, but it's not exactly their responsibility. You should be asking them, like, what's the plan after you let them know your goals. Let's see, what else did I have here? Oh, some other questions you could ask them is, what kind of approach are they going to take? Have they worked with a lot of stroke survivors? Do they take a neurological approach? So those are pretty valid questions. And if you go to if they say, well, I usually do orthopedic work, we've got another guy here who does, or woman here who does a lot with stroke survivors, then you should be asking for that other person. Do you have to have a neuro PT? No, actually, one of the best PTs I ever had, I got sent to. Well, it had the same exact name as the person I was supposed to go to, and he was orthopedic. And I flat out asked him, I said, well, what's the plan? He said, I'm not a neuro. And I said, well, what happens if it doesn't work? If our plan doesn't work? And what is the plan? And he told me what his plan was, and he said, if I can't help you, I'll find you a neuro PT. And I said, let's have at it then. That's the kind of answer you want to get from your PT, and that's the kind of relationship you want to have. And he ended up basically, I learned more from him than I did from the neuro PT, to be honest. And 5 weeks in or so, he's asked me how I felt about everything, and if I wanted to switch or if he was doing okay. So it's kind of a two-way street when you get this whole thing going, because now he's asking me how I feel about him. And I said, no, I'm staying right here. We're making good progress. And I learned a bunch from him. I came home every week and made videos about what he taught me. He had a real different approach than the neuro approach, and he actually knew a little bit about it. He'd worked with a number of stroke survivors. It wasn't like he was completely orthopedic PT. So let's see what else. Another question you might ask is, what do I have to do to stay in PT? Because, if you have that kind of relationship, the therapists have some latitude. If you're making your goals, you can oftentimes stay longer. If you plateau and you're not making any progress, then they start hearing the insurance company say, time to send them home. Most therapists do a little short evaluation every once in a while. You go in and you get real irritated because you're not going to learn anything today. They're going to check you. They're checking you against the first time you were there or the last time they checked you. And that was always annoying to me because I was there to learn, and it was like a review. And but that's another reason to do homework, because if you keep making your goals, then I think you have a chance of staying in. I know you do, because I had the neurophysical therapist kept me a number of months. I was only going once every week or once every 2 weeks, but she kept me a number of months because I kept making the goals. So those are some of my thoughts. I'm sure in all that, William, I made you think about some more things. So why don't I toss it back to you, and I'll take a quick look at these notes and see what else I got.
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to highlight, one of the things you said about goals. One of the things you said about goals, Ralph, and it actually reminded me of something. It reminded me of something which I saw them teaching, which I saw once in another stroke survivors recovery, and it's this idea of, and I think it's really important because it's this idea of asking or describing to your therapist what your goal actually looks like to you. So, for example, if you're going to see your occupational therapist or your physical therapist, and let's say your goal is to go to the shopping mall or go to Costco, what does that goal look like to you? And what does that goal look like to the physical therapist? Because to the physical therapist, if your goal is to go to the shopping mall and do some shopping, it could look like you going to the shopping mall in a wheelchair rather than going to the shopping mall when you're walking. So I really think, as a stroke survivor, in your therapy sessions, especially at the very start, and this goes along with what you said, Ralph, about setting goals and setting expectations, that it's really beneficial to sit down with your therapist and just let them know, hey, look, my goal is to actually be able to walk my daughter down the aisle at a wedding, in like 2 months. I don't want to do it in a wheelchair, obviously. But I actually want to do it like I would have if I didn't have my stroke. Because I think if you can get on the same page with your therapist about what your goal looks like, then one, that can actually steer the conversation and steer the whole therapy program and exercise program towards what you want it to go towards. And I'm assuming everyone watching this wants their therapy program to be geared towards more recovery rather than a compensation approach. But it also allows you to work a lot closely with the therapist and allows you to pick their brain on asking them how the exercises which they're suggesting are going to actually help you get back the movements which you need, or the movements that you require to actually be able to perform or do the thing which you want to get back to doing. So, for example, if it's going back to that example, walking your daughter down the aisle for her wedding, what does that what does that involve? It probably involves, being able to walk without the use of a cane. Um, assuming that's what you want to do. And it also probably involves, being able to balance and be able to actually hold someone else's hand and be able to sustain that balance for long enough so that nothing happens when you do perform that task as well. So I think if you really clarify those goals with your therapist, then there's not going to be any confusion, and your therapist and yourself can really hone in and dial in into, what the goal really looks like for you and how you want your recovery to look like. Because if you say something like you want to get your hand back to normal or you want to get back to cooking, for some therapists, the idea of getting back to cooking might be using a modified chopping board or modifying the kitchen so that you can actually cook using one hand rather than using both hands. But for yourself as a stroke survivor, your idea of cooking might actually look like yourself cooking with both hands like you used to before your stroke. So I think that that's a really important point. And not only does that steer the conversation more towards a recovery-based focused approach, but it also sets the expectation and it also sets up accountability between you both. And I think it's also, and I think just adding on to what Ralph said about the question about asking your therapist what they expect of yourself, I think as a stroke survivor, particularly in this journey, because it can be really hard to see changes in your recovery because you're living your recovery every single day. A good way of keeping accountability for yourself and also for your therapist is to go home and do the exercises that they suggest and take video. And every time you go see a therapist in their sessions, you take out the video and you take some time with the therapist and yourself to watch the video together and dissect and really talk about what you could do better and what exercises or what new exercises you could do to actually refine the way that you currently do something with the recovery that you've gotten back after your stroke. And this is something I personally did in my own journey when I was first learning how to walk. Is I would ask my brother to film myself walking in the hospital, and then I would watch it at nighttime, or I would watch it with the therapist in our sessions, and we would break down piece by piece what needs to happen in order for my walking to improve, what needs to happen in order to stop the knee hyperextension, and why it is that the knee is hyperextending, and what exercises are going to be relevant in order to actually address that problem. And so at the end of the day, I think if you have set these expectations and you're able to ask the right questions of your therapist, then you can get on the same page. And rather than it being a relationship where the therapist is just there and you're just going to the therapist expecting them to maybe fix you or expecting them to cure you, it can be more of like a collaborative relationship where you're both working towards the same goal. Because I think as a stroke survivor, if you're going to therapy through insurance and your therapist is only seeing you for 24 sessions, well, in a stroke recovery timeline, some things in recovery may take longer than 24 sessions. So I think if you can work together with the therapist, then you can be realistic about your goals. And if you don't say anything, first off, if you don't say anything to the therapist when you're going to see them through insurance, they're going to assume that they can probably help you compensate in your recovery to help you do things which you used to want to do, such as walking your daughter down the aisle on a wheelchair, rather than actually working on the components which are required to actually help you walk independently without a cane and actually reach your perception of how your recovery should look like after your stroke. So I think that's really important because I think often there's a miscommunication between therapists and the stroke survivor. And if as a stroke survivor you can really get into the habit of initiating and really controlling the steering wheel when it comes to your recovery after stroke, it allows you to not fall into the agenda of, I guess, the rehab hospital, which is basically where because hospitals they basically want you to reach quote unquote independence, and their view of independence is being able to do the essentials like going to the toilet, being able to dress yourself, and also being able to eat by yourself. And that might differ to your view of recovery after stroke. And your view of recovery after stroke is going to differ compared with every therapist which you interact with, because your therapist might see recovery after stroke completely different to your view of recovery, or they might see your goals and how they look like completely different to how you envision how you might achieve your goals in your recovery after stroke. So I think so I think that that's really important when it comes to recovery after stroke. Getting on the same page, developing a collaborative relationship, and asking for that feedback, and really keeping not only yourself accountable but your therapist accountable. Because if you don't do that, then it's going to be easy to really drop the ball and lose focus on what you actually want most out of your recovery. And because you only get a limited amount of sessions through insurance, you're working in a limited time window to leverage as much support as possible before you lose it and you're on your own. And I think that if if you can use the most out of your sessions with your therapist through insurance, then you'll be a lot better off once you're discharged from therapy than if you just went to therapy just expecting the therapist to just help you or just cure you.
Um, well, you mentioned, having the same vision. That's the reason that you talk about your goals and that vision, so that you make sure that the therapist understands what you want and that you're both working towards the same thing, which would be your vision, not compensating, which might be their vision or forced on them by the insurance company. So that's why it's important to have that initial goals and vision conversation. Yeah, video is a good way. It's another part of the feedback. It's important to get feedback, because if you can't improve when you're operating in a vacuum. Let's see, the wedding thing. I've known 4 people who that was their goal. One of their major goals. They may have had other goals. And I saw them post pictures of them doing it, all 4 of them, to various degrees, but they all got in the suit and walked down the aisle. Also, I've seen 10 or 20 people say, my goal is, this is comments and things in the stroke groups, I want to be able to pick up my kids with both hands. That's a real common one. One other point I want to talk about is that you should be having a lot of back and forth. I took one stroke survivor to physical therapy twice a week for a year, so that would be 100 visits. And I don't think he ever had to say, got any questions? And he'd go, nope. And I would go, I was doing physical therapy with him 2 other days every week. And so I would take that opportunity to ask them, what kinds of things should I be doing or changing? Should we be dropping anything? Should we be doing new stuff? And if we weren't going through something where we're going to drop something and start doing something else, I'd just ask them general questions. So when you go to therapy, a lot of times the therapist is in charge in the sense that they're showing you something. So that's not a time to go back and forth. But when you should be, listening, like your piano teacher giving you feedback and teaching you something new. But when you're having a discussion, I think you ought to be talking 50% of the time, because otherwise it's not really a discussion. Like I said, this guy I took never brought up anything. And when he was asked about having questions, he said no. And I think missed a opportunity there. Of course, I tried to pick up the slack by asking questions and changing his program and working with a physical therapist to keep him doing what my best idea of what he should be doing, since he wasn't being real proactive. So a lot of this comes down to, it's you that's got to get better. Physical therapists can't make you better. They can help you in your mission to get better, but you need to sometimes steer the ship. And like we've mentioned several times, steer it away from compensation. I would tell people, a lot of people want to get their hand back. They go to occupational therapists. When they get out the clothespins and start pinning them to your clothes to teach you how to do things one-handed and stuff, if your goal is to get that hand moving again, then you need to either address it with them or find another occupational therapist that's going to work with you towards getting better as opposed to compensating. So those are my thoughts. William, you got anything else?
No, nothing else. I think you've pretty much summed it up. Yeah, I think it really comes down to accountability and steering the ship in your recovery because, like I said at the start of this roadmap, recovery is not about the therapist, but recovery is about yourself as a stroke survivor. And what are you willing to do in your recovery, and how committed are you to this journey? Um, like some people go 3 or 6 months in their recovery and they see no change, and they get told by their therapist that this is as good as it's going to get, and that's it, end of the story. But if you probe your therapist and you keep them accountable and you ask them for the feedback and how you can get better, then it's likely that you're going to get a lot further in your recovery after stroke because you have that information available to you, and you're not being limited by what someone else wants for you in your recovery.
Well, just sum it up then and say, a lot of times when I see in the groups, somebody said, I'm not get better in 6 months or a year. If you ask them what they're doing, they aren't doing much. They're not doing what I would be doing. So that's problem number one. It doesn't just happen. So you've got to take responsibility. You got to drive the train or the car, because the therapist is somebody that's there to help you with the whole process, not to drive it. And back to the compensation, you got to be careful not to let them drive it in that direction. So I guess what we'll do, William, is on that note, we'll end this one. And thanks for your time, and we'll see everybody next time.